That's good.
All right, welcome to Halitics. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'm really delighted that a close friend, I'm going to call you a close friend, Jake. I mean, we've gotten to know each other well over the years, and I've always enjoyed working with you. I've always enjoyed your take on issues, and you're a totally dedicated progressive activist now in law school. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for doing me a favor and coming on the morning show. It's not the morning show, it's Halitics. My old show was the morning show. I get confused now and then, as you know from working with me. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well. It's been quite the eventful week, as you could probably guess, but I appreciate you inviting me on and giving me a platform to talk about what happened and my thoughts on organizing in general.
Well, it goes both ways, of course. I'm just as happy to have you on and talk about the incident on, was it Wednesday? I had left. This was Wednesday, I think, down on the Hill. And we're going to talk about Jimmy Dore a little bit, but just want to throw this out there. Jimmy actually covered you on his program yesterday, and you've gotten plenty of other, perhaps even higher profile media attention. Joy Reid, did she write about this, or the Reid Report or whatever? I don't know if she's higher profile, but what are some other groups? When I Googled MSNBC, NBC, have you been interviewed though yet, or am I your first interviewer?
Joy Reid her team did reach out for an interview on Friday evening. But again, the event did happen on Wednesday, so that would have been 2 days after. And I think they ended up canceling that, and they had Joy Reid's stand-in host on Thursday night, Michael Steele, who ironically is a Republican from here in Maryland. He was guest hosting for some reason, and so that interview never ended up happening. And I did get reached out for other interviews that my attorneys recommended that I put off for now, because I think there will be more news on this story in the future and other opportunities for interviews. But nonetheless, still wanted to take a chance to speak to fellow organizer, fellow activist, and I have been given the green light now to start talking about what happened publicly a little bit. And so I've done interviews with like a local news station, but this is my first on-camera interview, at least since before the weekend.
Well, I'm sure by the time the dust clears, a few dozen people will have seen you on this video. Let's play the clip. I hope people can hear it. I'm using a different software player, Jake, so I'm just warning everyone the audio may or may not go out. Let's hope it goes out. This was, by the way, courtesy of Christy Fogel, a third ally, an ally of ours, another great friend. And she's really big in the Medicare for All movement. And that's going to come into the conversation as well. But here's Jake with the Freedom Caucus. Is that, by the way, Dennis Prager next to you there? Is that man? Do you know?
It looks like Dennis Prager, doesn't it?
It really does.
I don't think it is. I wish it was. That would be a funny story to tell.
That would be pretty funny. From Prager University, my son has always been repeatedly told me that you know him too. Another activist you're friends with in the Ginsburg family, Jake, has repeatedly expressed his disappointment in not being accepted at Prager University. I've had to explain to him, you really don't apply, but
that's why I'm at University of Baltimore. Couldn't get in there.
Couldn't make it into Prager U. All right, here's Jake.
Yeah, I'm not hearing sound.
All right, we're not hearing it. I'm glad Jake said that, because we want to make sure folks are hearing the audio. So we had like I said, a bit of an issue. I want to get the media player to capture. And I knew there was going to be some issue with something going wrong with audio here. Well, let's just play it. You tell us what's going on here, Jake. It's really not a big deal without the audio in this case. You can really see what's going on. We'll start the video one more time. And here we go. So what's happening is basically, Jake, you're at a rally for the Freedom Caucus, right? The so-called
Yeah.
aka Freedom Caucus, and that bald man, stocky bald fellow, who starts out. You're approaching the podium. It appears. Tell us what you're doing.
Yeah,
Just
so to give a little background and take a step back to give full context here. So I was here in DC last Wednesday, I think May 17th. And how, as you mentioned, you were there that day as well. You were not here for this moment. You had left the event by the time that this happened, but you were there, I was there, and many other people from our organization, Our Revolution, and other healthcare organizers from the Maryland Progressive Healthcare Coalition, and a lot of national progressive organizing groups. We were all there at 2 p.m. that day because Senators Bernie Sanders and Representative Pramila Jayapal were both co-introducing their Medicare for All bills together. And so they're having a press conference and a rally to introduce that bill. And we were there with Our Revolution as supporters of that bill. And what I did not know about was that right after our Medicare for All rally, yes, there seemed to be a Freedom Caucus, Tea Party. I guess they've chosen a new name. They've moved on from the Tea Party. They call themselves the Freedom Caucus now, which is ironic that they're going to call themselves the Freedom Caucus while they have members violate my freedom of speech and my freedom to ask, Congress people questions on public property. But nonetheless, we were there for the Medicare for All rally, and then right after the Medicare for All rally, it turned out that the Freedom Caucus or Tea Party was having their own press conference, seemingly on the topic of fear mongering about the World Health Organization and, saying that COVID is all China's fault, which is very ironic that they're having a press conference about that issue while they don't support Medicare for All, which would have made the fallout of COVID-19 much, much, much less deadly here in Maryland. But nonetheless, I heard that these were all Freedom Caucus members. I didn't recognize most of them, but I did recognize two members in particular, and that was Representative Paul Gosar and Representative Lauren Boebert. And so I decided I wanted to stick around after the Medicare for All rally and ask them some tough questions about their records at their press conference. And so that's exactly what I did. And, this is the video that Hal is showing is the third person perspective. But even on my Twitter, at Jake_Burdett, Burdett, I have the first person videos that I took of these incidents. And I'd recommend people watch that because there was context of, stuff that happened before even this video. And that was this video that Hal's showing. I was asking a question to Lauren Boebert. But before the Lauren Boebert question even happened, I asked Representative Paul Gosar questions. I was questioning about his affiliations with infamous neo-Nazi Nick Fuentes. He actually did his own rally with Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is somebody who said really awful, terrible things, openly supports Hitler. This guy's the same age as me, by the way, but openly supports Hitler, says that interracial marriage is the same as bestiality. Truly, like a lot of people call anyone on the right a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi, but this guy, Nick Fuentes, actually really is a neo-Nazi, and Paul Gosar is out there doing rallies with this guy. And so I asked Paul Gosar to explain his connection and his affiliation with Nick Fuentes, and I also asked him about, Paul Gosar. This is a man who his politics and even on a personal level is so horrendous that his own family put out a campaign ad endorsing his opponent when Paul Gosar first got elected. And so I asked Paul Gosar about that as well. And if you watch my videos that I take of that moment, you see that, as Hal described him, I think bulky, bald man, Clay Higgins, who was not one of the politicians that I was asking a question, but nonetheless, I think is affiliated with the Freedom Caucus group. And so he took it upon himself, Clay Higgins, who I didn't know that it was Clay Higgins at the time because, again, I didn't recognize him. But
who would, right? And let me just interrupt because I think we've got the audio. I'm going to try anyway, so we can just go through this one more time quickly. But yeah, looks like security at a concert, and I'm surprised he didn't have a little ear thing dangling from his ear. One of those buzzers they use.
Representative Boebert, can we hear that? No, you're out. You're out. You're out.
So he's saying you're out, you're out. People can hear that. You're wearing your OR shirt.
Get off me.
It's the definition of manhandling.
And I think I even say that in the video.
Touching a person. You can't push him off the street. Get off him.
Let go of him. Let him know. Let him. You calm down. You need to calm down.
Calm down, sir.
And it's pretty funny because he's trying to say, calm down. But he's saying calm down when he's the one who was clearly, out of control in that moment.
Yeah, I think he either in the moment realized, because, I don't know if you had edited the audio at all there, but it was a little hard to hear. But there's a lot of people in the background saying, you're assaulting this man. Stop, get off of him. And so maybe Clay Higgins in the moment realized how inappropriate he was acting and became a little bit self-conscious of the optics and said that. But really, I think he was just trying to paint a false narrative about me as if I was the one who was, acting aggressive, acting physical with people, when really it was him, as everybody can see on the video. And disappointedly, the cops seem to side with Higgins's version of the story, despite many witnesses around contradicting his characterization of events. And again, the whole thing being on video. And now, again, at the time, I didn't know who Representative Clay Higgins was. Now I have done research into him. This guy used to be a cop. And in fact, he had to resign from being a cop because he was about to be fired for use of excessive force and then lying about it. And so this is a guy with a history of dishonest behavior and a history of abusing his authority to physically manhandle people, attack people in the way that he did to me in that video. And so, yes, first I asked the questions to Paul Gosar, and that's the first instance. And again, that's on video from my perspective. That's the first instance where Higgins decides to step in, intervene, and even in that first interaction, he does put his hands on me.
And you also, I think, when you asked about Bobert, it became even more aggressive on his end. You asked her about her divorce. So what were you trying to accomplish in this exchange, Jake? And let me just say, and Jimmy Dore actually did a pretty good job. I think you saw that video as well. I'm going to play a clip from Jimmy Dore's show, but not from the one where he talked about you. But you felt he covered it pretty well. He said, hey, maybe you're being a bit of a troll. You were being a troll, but you had every right to. This is in a public space. This is right outside the Capitol in a public park. It is exactly where you're supposed to express your opinions. And rather than, take Representative Higgins aside and say, hey, keep your hands off this man, they took you aside, despite the fact that you were not violating any laws whatsoever. Was that something you were trying to accomplish? In other words, did you want to get that reaction from Higgins?
No, absolutely not. I mean, when you ask tough questions to politicians, I think you do expect that they might not appreciate it. But at the end of the day, this is our First Amendment right to ask, either as a citizen or as a journalist, to ask politicians tough questions that they need to be asked, especially at a press conference, at a public taxpayer paid space right in front of the Capitol building. And so, maybe I did expect them to not be pleased with it, but did I expect, first of all, anybody to physically, touch me, assault me in that way? No, absolutely not. And then beyond that, do you expect a sitting elected official, a U.S. congressperson, to react that way? Absolutely not. I mean, I'm very critical of my local government, which I think a thing we'll talk about later on in the segment, local organizing. I'm very critical of my county executive, certain members of my county council members.
And these are Democrats, right? These are not Republicans. So you're not somebody who's hyper partisan. This was a situation where you were criticizing, I would say you were confronting Republicans and interrupting their event. So Jake Burdett with us. We don't want to spend too much more time on this because I think, as you mentioned to me off air and as I agreed, I think other issues are really more important, but this has thrust you into the public spotlight. People are very interested in what happened. And so obviously we want to talk about it. And I get the interview with you because we're friends and we know each other. We've organized together. So I appreciate that. You mentioned an attorney. I don't want you to, I know there, with the laws, potentially some legal action, you can't get into that. But is that where you think this might be headed?
Yeah, I think, again, I expected maybe the Congress people to not be pleased with being asked tough questions in that manner, but never in a million years would I have expected a sitting congressperson to lay hands on me and essentially try to act as hired security or staff. And to me, what that shows is that these elected officials have a scary level of entitlement and feeling above the law and feeling that they can't be challenged or put on the spot or made to look, uncomfortable by the public, by voters. And if they're allowed to sort of get away with this behavior, to me, it emboldens them and it makes them feel that there are no consequences. And so, I would like to hold Representative Higgins accountable for his actions in whatever way I can.
And this is based on a view that, your constitutional rights are sacred, right? I mean, do you feel that there's a political benefit that could accrue to either the Democratic Party or progressives by virtue of some type of, by virtue of what happened? Is that even in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think about it in a partisan lens like that, because the thing is, maybe a certain party sets a precedent, but once that precedent is set, as we know, it can be easily abused by both parties. I mean, we have George Bush, going into all these countries without official declarations of war, and people pin that on the Republican Party, and maybe they started that trend. But then you have Obama get elected, and well, now the door's open. Now the tool's in the toolkit. So of course the Democratic Party is going to use it too. And so, again, I choose not to think about it in that lens. I more just think about the scary precedent that it sets. And I hope that people from all across the political spectrum can agree that that's not a precedent that we want to be set, of elected officials being allowed to physically remove, put hands on, potentially
in a public area, in a public space where you have every right to speak out. It's no one's paid to be there. There's not an audience that, has, either, went out of their way or paid extra money to be at that site. That said, we're going to transition to the event that you and I were at beforehand and talk about, when I say beforehand, just before what happened, and also maybe play some of Door's take. Right now, though, I want to let folks know you're watching Halitics. Obviously, I'm Hal, Jake Burdett with us. Please click subscribe in the bottom right corner. Jake, I'm at 96 subscribers. Not bad. Now you got to get to 1,000 to get any money out of this, but hopefully it's kind of viral. So, there's an exponential growth. So 1 to 10 is the same as 10 to 100 is 100 to 1,000. So if that's the case, we're on the way. We'll see. That's the story I'm telling myself, and I'm sticking to it. All right, let's get to, so Jimmy did give a nice solid for you, I guess, although you don't know him. But in our group, there's a lot of criticism of Door. I'm join a lot of your criticism of him. In fact, I was going to play the video, but let's play this video of him just totally bashing the event. And you should know that some of the criticisms, though, that you leveled at Door are identical to those that I leveled last week. So I'm hardly, in the tank for him. Unfortunately, there are people who are. We have to be critical and skeptical of everybody, especially if they have any influence at all. Let's see if we can get this. So here's the Door video. I think you can see that now, Jake. You should be able to see that.
Yep.
We'll see if we can play this for folks. Bernie's there, and I'll go full screen in a little bit, but let's see if this works.
And I've not seen this yet. I saw his segment about me, but I saw him reference this in the segment, but I haven't watched it. So
right. I think he was a little bit like, because he was not at all he was very negative, shall we say, about this event. And I want to address that because it also goes to people, canceling Jimmy and whether, when you should disregard somebody altogether, if ever. So here's the clip. And I guess it's, what is it? Snowflake alert. No, what is it when they tell you have to be careful? There might be something that will offend somebody in it.
Trigger warning.
Trigger warning.
Yeah.
There's no identity insults, but he does use some obscenities. So people who are uncomfortable with that, just know that.
This guy, Congressman Greg Caucus, he said,
let me just stop it right there. So he embarrassed himself right there. And again, I am more of a fan of Jimmy Dore than pretty much anyone I know. But again, I'll be negative. He blows it there. His name is not Cusser. It's Kassar. So he gets that wrong right away. It's not Greg Cusser, Jimmy. It's Kassar.
Senator Sanders and some other friends reintroducing Medicare for all. So they reintroduced Medicare for all because all of a sudden now, after the Democrats don't have any power, now they want to push for Medicare for all. I wonder if this is going to set it back. Aren't we on the 1 yard line? And if you do this, it's going to.
All right. So let me interrupt it again because I really want to go through this, Jake. He gets another thing wrong there. He implies, doesn't quite say it, Jake, but he implies that this is some sort of a new, that the Democrats hadn't introduced Medicare for all in the last Congress, which is false. When it was controlled by Democrats, there was an introduction, very similar. It was a high-profile, big noise event, much like this was. That said, I think the bigger point is they got no chance. It's not going to happen. You've got a Republican Congress. And when Democrats did control the House, though Jayapal, Sanders, more Jayapal, I think, and the squad, they were pretty half-assed and half-hearted about pushing for it. Is that a fair criticism?
I mean, I don't necessarily know if I agree with your characterization that that's what Jimmy was saying. To me, I think it's wrong to conflate the Democrats with the squad and with Bernie. I think, obviously the squad and Bernie are part of the Democratic Party to some degree, but they're, sort of the left-wing flank of the Democratic Party. And, I agree with what you said in the first half of, Jimmy, what are you talking about that, Bernie and Jayapal haven't introduced Medicare for all every year? They have introduced Medicare for all every single year.
Well, every Congress. So they don't, it's every other year actually, but So last time they introduced it was in 21 because that was for the Congress that lasted 2 years.
Yeah, I see what you're saying because they only elect. It's not yearly elections; it's every 2 years.
Right.
But point is, they're introducing the bill. They're fighting for the bill every session, regardless of who has the majority, regardless of who the president is. Do I agree with the tactics that they use? Do I wish that they played hardball a little bit more? Yes, I do, and I think that that's a fair critique to make. But again, I agree with you, and you said the strong implication from Jimmy was that they hadn't been introducing this bill in the past when Democrats did have control, but they have.
Right, but to his bigger point, I think, and he's made it over and over again. I mean, this isn't the first time, so maybe you have to know his program is that when they've had opportunities to try to hold the Democratic Party accountable in some way, and he's bitter because he forced the vote, which, I personally think was a brilliant idea, and instead got all this pushback and people bashed him for it as though there was something wrong with the Democrats trying to hold their leadership accountable and say, let's have a vote. Let's put people on the record. So I think he's really angry. I mean, he's angry and he's handling it badly, maybe, but he's pissed off about that.
Yeah, and I was forced the vote advocate at the time, and I still stand by the strategy today, and I think that it was a good idea. But yeah, I just think that Jimmy goes a little far in his critiques, further than I would go. But on the strategy, I am with you guys there.
All right, let's play some more of this video.
Push us back. We're going to have to punt. You're going to actually push for Medicare for all? I thought, so when they actually had the leverage to do something about it, they didn't. And now that they don't, this is called virtue signaling. This is Bernie Sanders virtue signaling. He's never going to fight for you to get Medicare for all. He's never going to use his leverage, and neither is Representative Pramila Jayapal. In fact, when they had leverage and activists like us tried to get them to use their leverage, they called us violent and said that we were setting the movement back because they will never fight for you. Bernie Sanders is never going to fight for you. Bernie Sanders.
All right. So again, going too far, Jake, I'm with you 100%. But, and here's the but, this is what frustrates me. That's valuable, right? To me, to my way of thinking, having someone say that where there is truth to it, it's too far. I do not agree. Bernie Sanders has done some good things, and he has fought for people. He fought for us in the Affordable Care Act, got a lot of money for rural health care, for inner city care, which made a big difference. Now, I mean, Jimmy could fairly say a lot about that, maybe, but it's not accurate. Bernie Sanders did a lot for veterans. He won Center of the Year from a veterans group back in 2015 because he did so much to get care for veterans. So again, going too far, but isn't it valuable, I think, to have a voice out there that is going to be this caustic, this aggressive against the Democratic Party and really push, I think, us to examine our allegiance to this institution?
I think it can be helpful depending on the way that it's done, but I think it's not helpful when it's done in a very inconsistent way. And I feel like that is unfortunately the way that Jimmy wants to do it. If we want to say we're going to hold every elected Democrat, even our allies, to like the strictest of purity tests, I suppose that's a fair approach to take, but you need to take that approach to every elected official who claims to be an ally. And a perfect example of Jimmy, in my opinion, not doing that is he refused to even endorse Bernie Sanders when he ran for president in 2020. To me, that's Jimmy Dore actually not fighting for the progressive movement when he by far was the only realistic shot that the left actually had to gaining any sort of power. And you want to tell me he didn't fight for that and fight for that in 2016? He did fight. Did he go as far?
Well, he did endorse Bernie in 2016. He endorsed AOC, I believe, in 2016 as well, if that's when she first ran. And then he was profoundly disappointed by her, and understandably so. But the 2020 race, and again, maybe because I watched pretty much all of his videos, the reason, and Jimmy ultimately did endorse Tulsi Gabbard. He
was not a Medicare for all supporter.
She claimed to be. She claimed to be, and it's true. To be fair, her record on Medicare for all is not as strong as Bernie's, but she did say she was for Medicare for all. If you go back, you can find a few places where she claimed to be. But Jimmy also
didn't she have her Medicare for all extra, like she had her own.
I can't remember now, so maybe you're right about that. But you're also holding then a purity test or a litmus test, as though you can endorse someone if they're not for Medicare for all. I'm not always against purity tests, and I actually think, but I'm throwing that in your face just because you made it as,
that's
something
a different purity test. That's a different. One is, do you support the policy? One is, do you fight for the policy as aggressively as I would like you to? And to me, those are different purity tests.
I would say that what really caused Jimmy not to endorse Bernie, and I remember him talking about this, was Bernie's support for the very large bloated Pentagon budgets and his refusal to call out Israel for the Palestine settlements. So those issues were massively important to Jimmy, and I think it's fair. I also would point out Bernie didn't run, and I'll let you respond, and then we're going to have to move on. But I'll let you respond to this, and then we'll move on to another topic or a related topic because we don't have that much time. But I also think it's fair to say that Bernie did not campaign quite as far to the left in 2020, especially on economic issues, as he had in 2016.
Yeah. Again, I think that there are fair critiques about Bernie not fighting as hard on issues as we would like, including, being weaker on foreign policy than we would like. But that being said, he was still by far the most anti-imperialist candidate, the furthest left candidate, besides maybe Mike Gravel, who was not really a serious candidate, in my opinion. But Tulsi Gabbard, that's my thing. If anybody can use nice sounding rhetoric, and for some reason Jimmy accepts it at face value when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard, and he does not dig beneath the surface at all and dig into her past and her record and what other issues is she supporting. Oh, she's actually incredibly hawkish on foreign policy. It's just, just our troops getting killed that she's not supportive of. And so, I agree with a lot of the criticisms about Sanders. I don't necessarily know if I agree that he didn't run as far to the left in 2020 as he did in 2016. My disagreement, my criticisms of his 2020 campaign are actually quite similar to the 2016 criticisms I have of that campaign. And that's just, he was far too complimentary to his opponent, Joe Biden, in 2016, Hillary Clinton. He didn't really take the gloves off in the way that he needed to. But I do think his policy agenda and platform was still basically the same as it was in 2016. But those are my criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard. I don't like Jimmy's my perceived inconsistencies there. I don't like that he's so turns off the skepticism for literal, fascist aligned groups like the Boogaloo Boys, but then will treat the squad like actual traitors. It's all a little too far for me. But Jimmy, if you're watching, I do appreciate your segment defending me. I know your audience, it looks like in the comment sections, they may not have agreed.
It was mixed. It was mixed. I looked at those comments. So we will move on. I gave you the last word. I don't necessarily agree with those words, but we also have only a limited amount of time, and I try to give my guests as much time to respond as I take for myself. There was more from this letter, and there's quite a bit more we'll get to. I cut part of it out where you talked about Jimmy Dore, mainly because we just had that conversation. It would be redundant. But I do want to just talk briefly about Jamie Raskin, where you write, Raskin is no Bernie, but I do think he is worth endorsing for our group, meaning our revolution, Maryland, if he jumps in. This is for U.S. Senate. I have indicated tepid support for Will Jawando, who is a Montgomery County Council member who was in the Obama administration. I'm not a huge fan of Jawando's. I think there are issues with Jawando. I might not support Jawando in the end. That said, I could never endorse Jamie Raskin. He is considered by so many as a hero on the left. And I want to just explore that briefly, Jake, before we talk about local organizing. Also because, to a degree, this is somewhat of a local topic and it is relevant to who we elect. I don't think he's running, so in a way it's kind of moot, but I think we should focus on this because it goes so to progressive strategies. And to me, the impeachment of Trump was the third impeachment, because there were three. There was a Russiagate impeachment, there was a Ukrainegate impeachment, both of those completely fizzled, and the evidence didn't support either one in any way. Then there was the January 6th impeachment after Trump was out of office, which Raskin led. To me, that was arguably the most disastrous of all. It was a complete waste of, it was a distraction. It took our minds off of what was possible, maybe like Medicare for all, like some kind of real action, meaningful action on fossil fuel emissions. But instead, Raskin distracted the media, which it was all too happy to be distracted, with this kind of hyper partisanship that divides people not along class lines, but along racial lines, along ethnic lines, along rural versus urban lines. And I think that was a huge disservice, anti-progressive, And just to finalize, is part of the reason, and see, I always mess this up when at some point I always show a slide when I'm not ready to show it quite yet. So let me get the slide in correctly where you can see the whole thing. But I would say that hyper partisanship, that Trump, I would call it derangement syndrome, but if you want to say it's not deranged, that's who Trump is. He is a horrible, evil fascist. Fine. Okay. Whatever you want to call it, by focusing so much on Trump, the Democratic Party has created us, and not focusing, which Jamie Raskin gave them cover to do. And I know this is a long peroration. This is why Trump has a significant lead in two of the last four polls and a lead in three of the last four polls over Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a fan of, the Democrats just going, super anti-Trump all the time. It was a strategy that clearly didn't work in 2016. They got lucky in 2020 with COVID, and, Biden was able to pull it off. And, the January 6th stuff, I do think January 6th was very serious, very scary thing that happened, considering how close the insurrectionists actually kind of did get to really, getting close to the Congress people and actually doing some damage. And yeah, I mean, I do agree that, I do think that stuff does merit investigation. It does merit discussion, but I do agree that it's abused by the Democratic Party to have to avoid having to talk about policy or actually doing anything for the American people. Reminds me of the Russiagate stuff after they lost to Trump in 2016 and how they used that as a distraction. And while I don't agree with you that the January 6th stuff has been the catastrophic failure that you have kind of characterized it as, and, part of my evidence would be they did, I thought the Democrats were going to get whooped in the 2022 midterms, but they actually, fared a lot better than people thought. And so while I personally don't agree with the January 6th strategy, again, I do think it's worth some discussion, but I think the Democrats have kind of dropped the ball on policy, especially Joe Biden. I do agree that probably explains these poll results and Trump, still sticking around. But at the end of the day, in terms of electoral strategy and defending my position that, if Raskin gets in the race for U.S. Senate, I think it is worth our revolution backing. It's all about, you have to consider who the other candidates in the race are. It sounds like you think that Jamie Raskin is too in bed with the Democratic establishment. I think that's a fair critique. But I mean, have you looked at Angela also, Brooks? Have you looked
Well, no,
at
I would never support Angela. I agree. She's not a good option in any way. So the announced candidates are the Prince George's County executive, Angela Alsobrooks, who's really just a complete corporate shill, right? I mean, everything she's doing is to try to slow down and throw sand in the wheels of the progressive council that was elected, which is really trying to rein in development, not stop it, but have the development that goes forward in that relatively poor county with a lot of challenges, have the development that does occur there not lead to black flight or people of color flight, and not lead to housing costs that are not, that are astronomical, but benefit the people who live there now and lead to decent conditions. So I agree. Also, Brooks is a major problem. Jawando, I think, again, I'm somewhat tepid on, but he has been more progressive in the Montgomery County Council than also Brooks has been in Prince George's. And then who is the third choice? There is a third candidate.
David Trone.
Who's completely unacceptable.
He will buy, he's going to spend like $20 or $30 million trying to buy the seat. So what we have is a rich guy, very conservative rich guy trying to buy the race. You have he's a congressman
now. He's a congress member from Western Maryland. He lives actually in the most affluent, or one of the most affluent cities, Potomac. And as I understand, it's a DC suburb. He is the CEO of Total Wine & More. And as I understand, he doesn't even live in his district. It's District 6 that he is representing, he lives in District 8, which is Raskin's district.
See, I didn't even know that, but that's how much money he's got, that he can buy a congressional district that he doesn't even necessarily live in. And so you have this guy who's like a parody of a rich person, very conservative. You have Angela Also Brooks, who is like the epitome of the Democratic establishment. She's the person that the Democratic establishment in Maryland is going to get behind. And, you know, it's like electing another, you know, Nancy Pelosi or Hakeem Jeffries to not the House, but to the U.S. Senate.
And it's all going to be, you have to vote for her. She's a black woman. If you don't, then you're racist and you're sexist.
And then you have Jamie Raskin, who is he what I would love him to be? No, he's not even, you know, on the level of Bernie Sanders or the Squad. You know, he's maybe more of an Elizabeth Warren type. But I would still much rather have another Elizabeth Warren in the U.S. Senate than a David Trone in the U.S. Senate, you know? And at the end of the day, I know that Jamie Raskin's going to support Medicare for all. And every U.S. senator that we can get that supports Medicare for all is a good thing. I cannot confidently say that about Angela Also Brooks. And that's just one issue. You know, name the Bernie Sanders agenda platform. Jamie Raskin probably at the very least nominally supports it, whereas he does do things without permission from the establishment at some points, whereas Angela Also Brooks, it's the establishment that made her, and she's going to listen to them on every single issue. And so I hate that term pragmatic, being a pragmatic progressive, but in this race I do think it might merit that type of thinking. But the bigger point I want to make is,
let me just say, I agree with you about Also Brooks and Trone. I don't think that there's any way a progressive organization could legitimately endorse either one. My point is more, I have a real problem endorsing Raskin as well, and I would never support that. I do think Jawando is worth looking into very closely.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's fair, but the point I was going to make is, like, I don't necessarily like being in these positions either, where you have to potentially endorse somebody who you feel is the lesser of two or three evils. And so that's what, but when we play the federal politics game, until we build a healthy local bench of down ballot progressives, that we're always going to be stuck between these choices. And so that's why I try not to spend too much time focusing on it, and instead focusing on the local level, on local organizing, so we can get progressives elected at the local level, build a local base, so that then we can have people compete for these congressional seats when they open up. And I think it's real problem that the progressives don't focus on these local races and don't have an understanding of these local issues, because that's why we're in these positions. That's why we don't have a bench lined up. And also it makes it very difficult for us to fairly and objectively evaluate a local politician's record when they do try to jump from a local to a state or federal office. You know, I hear you saying how, well, Jawando, he's pretty progressive, isn't he? He's pretty progressive, isn't he? Well, what is that really? Like, this isn't a rhetorical question. Like, genuinely, like, what is that based on?
Well, he has really led on police reform.
In what way?
In Montgomery County.
In what?
To have a citizens commission that would oversee the allegations of police brutality.
Yeah, I mean, that you're talking about the police accountability boards. That was mandated by state law. Every single county has to pass that by state law. And then this is my point of, you know, a local politician can just say, "Oh, I'm really progressive. I fought for police reform," and then
he's been there. This has been a lot of pushback against that. There's a lot of, I don't think that's really fair, Jake. There's been a lot of pushback in the county against it, and there's a lot of flexibility within the county how those boards are implemented. And Jawando has stood with the most progressive people in the county to have real, meaningful reform. So I don't think that's fair, and I'd have to look into some other issues as well. As I mentioned, I'm not certain I do support Jawando. And I want to talk to Ed about that, one of our other activists who's very knowledgeable, Ed Fishman. I'm just making the point that he has at least seemed to show some independence. from what
Yeah,
the Democratic establishment wants.
Yeah, and I'll fully
And-
acknowledge of the Montgomery County Council members, Jawando is definitely one of the best, definitely one of the most progressive. But with that being said, I think this is what I'm talking about of progressives will have the strictest of strictest purity tests when it comes to Bernie Sanders and Jayapal. And then when it comes to the local level, it's like, oh, you said the police need to be reined in and like, put in like an amendment to do. Okay.
No, I'm absolutely happy to. I disagree with that. I don't think that's fair at all, Jake. I mean, we all look at there's always a I don't know what we're not on a line, right? I mean, there's issues. People are all over the place on different issues. I generally support Bernie, but I don't always support Bernie. That's why I don't believe in canceling anybody. I agree with you that elections are tests, but to the extent I have a litmus test, it's are they doing good or are they doing harm? I'm just simply not going to be in a position where I'm going to vote for a Democrat who I think is going to make things really bad, and I'm not even certain they'll make things worse, that they won't make things worse than the Republican. I'm not convinced in 2016 that Trump was a worse choice, even now, despite as bad a president as he was in a lot of ways. I'm not convinced that Hillary Clinton would have been less bad than Trump. So, I mean, to me, that's the question. I think I think Jamie Raskin has harmed our country. I think it's not a question of a purity test. It's that I look at what Raskin's done and I think he's given cover to the Democratic corporate establishment. I think voting for Hakeem Jeffries to be minority leader, as he did and every member of the squad did, was bad. I think it hurt our country. I think they should have taken a stand. I think failing to force the vote was harmful to our country. I think they are allowing the Democratic Party to present itself as somehow, some way on the side of the American people. And frankly, the American people get that it's a load of crap. That's why and I just put on the screen when you were talking about Elizabeth Warren, I agree with you. Elizabeth Warren and Raskin are pretty similar. They're both sort of faux-aggressive intellectuals. And right now, in dark blue Massachusetts, according to the latest poll, she's down by 15 points to Charlie Baker, the former governor.
Yeah.
People recognize that these Democrats are full of shit. They're not on our side. They get it. They recognize that they carry water for corporate elites and, pretentious, condescending academic elites.
Yeah. No, I again agree with a lot of the criticisms that you say. I just think the question that we have to ask is not, if I could have anybody in the Senate, would I pick Jamie Raskin? It's, here's the people running, who would be the least bad options. And again, the point is you understand national politics very well. And so it's very easy to look at Jamie Raskin's record and identify here's, this issue, this issue, this issue, this issue that's problematic, but you don't follow local politics nearly as closely. But my point is you can build a similar track record of things that Jawando, even being one of the better members of the county council, has done of similar things where he didn't stand up to special interests the way that he should have. The only difference is there's no accountability for that at the local level because there's nobody following it and understanding it. But he voted, Jawando, voted to override Mark Elrick had vetoed the appointment of a complete developer shill onto the local planning board, a guy named James for Rockville. And Mark Elrick rightly vetoed it. And, Jawando and the council voted 11-0 to override Elrick's veto. And so that's just one example of Jawando going along to get along. And I'm sure that there's a million other examples I could find, but I don't follow Montgomery County local politics that closely.
So that's really important information, and I appreciate your sharing it. You know that, and I clearly didn't. And as I mentioned, I think we should look at Jawando. I know for a fact that I would not support Trone, I would not support Also Brooks, and I would not support Jamie Raskin. I have not known for a fact that I wouldn't support Jawando. But based on what you're saying, and I'm definitely not going to support Jawando, but what you've said makes it much less likely that I would support Jawando. This is what we have to talk about. But the fact that I'm not going to support Jawando wouldn't mean now I'm going to support Jamie. It means I'm not going to support anyone then, or try to get a real progressive to run.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's a difference between there's doing the bare minimum, like there's like, acknowledging that there's no ideal perfect candidate here, and my time is very valuable and limited, and so I only like to use it on candidates and campaigns that are perfect or ideal. And so if there's no perfect or ideal candidate in the race, I'm not going to waste my time on that race. But might I still vote? Might I still publicly, express support, or at least say this is the least bad of the candidates, in my opinion, for those who want to know, here's how I came to that conclusion. That takes very little effort. It takes very little time. You can do it one time, then move on, and then focus on like the real races that really matter. And so I'm with you on like, I don't even know if I'm going to, publicly support any of these candidates. I'm more just talking about, I guess, gun to my head, if I have to choose somebody, here's who I choose, and not even gun to my head, I'll probably voluntarily vote.
I mean, don't you think if you think a candidate is really good, then you vote for that, then you endorse them. If you think they're going to be okay and they're better than the alternatives, you vote for them. I don't know that I would vote for Raskin, but the question is really, do we endorse early? And I'm just making the point, I can't, based on what I know, I would not endorse Jamie Raskin.
Yeah.
I would not endorse anyone rather than endorse Raskin. That said, I have indicated I would consider endorsing Jawando, but you've made a very fair point that Jawando's taken some very bad positions that might well rule him out as well. And it's not a purity test, it's a balancing test.
Yeah. It is a balancing test. And, I guess we could potentially agree to disagree. Really, I think it's a conditional thing. I think, you just have to look at the competitiveness of the race, what's at stake, how big of the race is. And to me, U.S. Senate is a pretty big deal. It's not up very often in Maryland. And to me, while Raskin isn't what I want him to be, there is still a chasm of difference between Raskin and also Brooks and or even David Trone. And the establishment's going to go with one of those two. And to me, that says a lot, that if Jamie was really that establishment, the establishment would have been begging Jamie to run for Senate instead of begging Angela also Brooks to run for Senate. And, the other thing is, I understand what you're saying of, an endorsement's one thing, a vote's another thing, but I'm also going on based on the past of other candidates that this organization, Our Revolution Maryland, has endorsed, who are far more problematic than Jamie Raskin, even as recently as John King with, the last governor race. So it's like, if we're not going to hold those people to that level of scrutiny, it seems like we're being a little unfair to Jamie Raskin.
Well, I guess we'll just disagree on King, because I thought King ran as a true progressive. He was the only candidate who ran as a true progressive. He ran for Healthy Maryland. He ran against he was, I'll never forget Jake when he said, and I know we're going to talk about local, but maybe we won't get there. I'm going to have you back if you'll come back and we can really just talk about local. But I'll just make this point. He was asked about, we asked the candidates on a forum about the casino industry, which is incredibly regressive, incredibly destructive industry. And all the other candidates, including Perez, Rushern Baker, and I can't remember, I think even Ashwani Jain, who ran pretty far to the left compared to the other candidates, talked about how the wonderful benefits of the casino industry to Maryland, because there were some good union jobs that came out of them. But King no. He said, hey, this is very, very regressive. This is taking money from people who are ill, because if you have a gamaholism, you're ill. It's regressive because poor people lose a higher percentage of their income by far. It's very, very damaging to our society, and it's a way to avoid raising taxes on the wealthy and having true tax progressivism. And I thought that was such a powerful answer, and that he was willing to say that spoke volumes to me about John King. So I'm not sure what you're talking about when you feel like he wasn't the progressive candidate.
Yeah, no, I think with that issue in particular, it is that's also a balancing issue, because you have to balance personal responsibility and serious life ruining addictions with people's personal freedoms to like make those choices. Just like alcoholism can destroy somebody's life, drug addiction can destroy somebody's life.
That's fair. And if you want to have a low stakes poker game, I would legalize those. But we're talking about casino gambling, which is completely stacked against the gambler, and it's impossible to win. And if you are able to demonstrate that you can beat the odds because either you're great at picking sports games, some sports winners or losers, or maybe you have the ability to count cards in blackjack, which are the only two ways I think anyone can consistently beat the house, they'll ban you. They'll just kick you right out, and the law allows them to do that. So I don't think it's the same. I don't think a personal choice is the same as someone who's addicted and is spending their family's rent money or food money or healthcare money at tables.
Yeah, and it's a again, a life ruining addiction potentially, just like any other. And I do think that the casinos and the gambling industry have bought off our state government, and there's not nearly enough regulation. That is part of the reason why the addiction can get as bad as it can. But the same thing can happen with an alcoholism or with a drug addiction, of people stealing from their family members to feed the addiction. But that point aside, the bigger point I want to make is, yes, there's what a candidate says. And do I have anything against what John King necessarily said on the campaign trail? No,
well, this is how he campaigned. I mean, it's not just what he said. He campaigned. He was the one candidate who ran a progressive campaign.
Yes, it's how you campaign. It's what you said, but it's also, well, your life didn't just start when you ran for this. You've lived an entire life. What did you do in your record? Oh, look at that. John King never been in support of Medicare for all in the past. John King, big charter school guy in the past. John King, straight out of the Obama administration.
I think a lot of that, what you're getting there, really, that's an unfair assessment. I don't think it's completely inaccurate, but it's unfair to a degree as well. And
how so?
His record was with, not, as I understand it, nonprofit charter schools. It was years before he ran. I do have an issue with him serving in the Obama administration. But to be honest, Jake, you also made the point that you have to compare the choices. And there was no choice that was remotely as progressive running in that race, or who had a record that was even, the records of the other candidates were frankly worse than John King's. I mean, Perez's record was very problematic. Wes Moore had really no record whatsoever. He was an Oprah guy who had also made a ton in finance. So I don't know if you're saying, well, we got to look at the different candidates. King was the most progressive of that group, and it was none of them had a progressive history. Rashawn Baker was a supporter of the casinos, and I believe, was it Perez? One of them was a big fan of the inter-county connector, which is just disastrous for the environment. Also, on a very important issue, the bridge, right? The toll roads. King was the one who was most prepared to go out and say, no, we don't want to expand highways. We don't want to give for-profit companies control over our byways and spend billions to put more cars on the road.
Well, now you're actually adopting my position of, hey, it does make sense to not have.
Sometimes it does, yeah, but I would say, but King's positions were good for our state. Raskin has not adopted positions that I think are particularly good for our state.
I mean, he supports Medicare for all. He does support all these things, but nonetheless,
it's meaningless. It doesn't. He didn't support it. He didn't support it to the point where he would challenge his I don't know how you can even say he supports Medicare for all. He didn't support
He
force the vote. He opposed. No, but he opposed force the vote. He voted for Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi, and both of them have done everything possible to prevent Medicare for all from coming to a vote. So how can you say he supports that?
I'm saying if you think that a former Obama administration official would not also blindly vote for the establishment choice for Speaker of the House, you are so wrong.
Well, he wasn't running. He wasn't running for Congress, and we didn't have an opportunity.
It's about predicting, is this person going to go against the establishment and how.
So then you're saying, so then why are you, if that's how you feel, if you feel that every single Democrat will line up in support of whoever the Democratic establishment wants, even if they're a candidate whose top two biggest donors are the financial service industry and APAC, because that's who Hakeem Jeffries is, then why not troll? Why not go after the Democrats at their Medicare for All rally rather than the Freedom unquote caucus, which at least did hold out against voting for Kevin McCarthy until they got real concessions?
Because the things that they were getting concessions on would be hurtful for the American people. But really, I just don't think that me going up and doing that at the Medicare for All press conference, with people who, again, I don't agree with their strategy, but I do at least view as ideological allies. Like, to me, that would not have been an effective approach. But I want to bring the conversation back to this John King thing real quick, because you said a couple things that are, to me, problematic. And one, that you said that somebody has a nonprofit as if that means anything, because that suggests to me that you don't realize how nonprofits can be used to make a shit ton of money on all the time. And so that's a common trick used by corporate Democrats, corporate Republicans, or just, slick, corrupt people in general, as they form something as a nonprofit to throw the scent off of it. I put something in the Zoom chat here. John King maybe hasn't worked, maybe founded the charter school years ago, but he still stands by the charter school. He still makes videos promoting the charter school to this day. I have a feeling that that's a big reason why he was the Department of Secretary of Education in the first place. And so, there's what somebody says. Maybe John King said all the right things, but again, he has this history that contradicts that. And to me, it seems like we're holding him to a different standard than we're holding like a Bernie Sanders, because with Bernie Sanders,
are you saying I am? Because my issues with Bernie, to the extent I have them, are on his supporting bloated military budgets, his failure to take on the Democratic Party. So I don't see that as a difference.
I guess I'm talking about the way that Jimmy Dore was described, which I guess you said that you also agree that Jimmy was going too far. But basically, it seems like we choose to give people more chances, give people who have far less of a positive track record more chances than people who do have a long track record. And
who besides, let's put Bernie aside. Who in the race for governor, you didn't like the endorsement of John King, who was a better choice in the Democratic field?
That was another thing I wanted to explain. So thank you for bringing that up. So again, I said, sometimes it's all conditional based on the race, how powerful it is, who are the other candidates, what is the difference between this candidate and the other candidate. And with Raskin, to me, there is a great enough difference between Raskin and also Brooks or Trone to justify, endorsing somebody who, doesn't meet our purity test. But with this, I do think that arguably there were other candidates. Well, if I was on the board of OR Maryland at that time, I would have said the obvious thing that we should do is just not endorse anybody, because there's no clear argument. And there's like different, there's some people who really like Tom Perez, some people who really like John King, some people who like Francho, but some people like Rashurin Baker. But to me, there was no consensus. And I think it was a divisive move that OR Maryland made by endorsing in that race. And I think, some people even left the organization because of that. But I don't think that would be the case with Raskin. But who I decided to go with in the in that race, the governor's race, was, believe it or not, I ended up voting for Peter Franchot, just because, again, he's a guy who's very problematic. He refused to endorse Ben Jealous in 2018, but at the end of the day, in my opinion, of all the people running, all the front runners particularly running, he was the one who had the best record of standing up to the Democratic machine here in Maryland.
Jake, let me just throw one thing at you. Franchot voted in support. He was the deciding vote in support of the supersized privatized highways.
Yeah, and again,
to me, that's talk about just a horrible decision. I mean, what's the biggest issue we face in the world is the climate catastrophe, and he voted to make it worse. He also voted to increase wealth and income inequality, because the privatizing the highways would be an unfair tax on the poor, and make it mean they'd have to sit in traffic jams while rich people zoomed on by.
Yeah, so, it was a bad vote. It was a bad vote, but my point is, you're assuming that John King would not also vote for incredibly inequitable policies.
Well, he didn't he campaigned to the far to the left. He might have lied. Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Listen. Here's also what he campaigned on. He had lobbyists for the worst developers, at least in my county, working on his campaign, and he's running on taking housing and zoning and local land use policy away from localities and moving it to the state so that he could control it. So he wasn't going to do shit on Medicare for all. Any of the good things that he said, he wasn't going to do shit about it, because he saw that there's a progressive lane and that he can dupe you and trick you all into.
Well, I'm glad you're in his head. I'm glad you're in the man's head, because, and again, I think that argument would be better if you had an alternative who had a true progressive record that was more progressive than King's. But we're obviously not going to settle this here. We're just going back. Who had a progressive, who had a record that was more progressive than King's. That's all. There was no one. We disagree.
Peter Franchot,
you know what, Jake? We disagree. We totally disagree on that.
No, but let me explain.
I do not. Well, it's 12-10. No, because it's not just one vote. I even asked Franchot. His argument was on the climate catastrophe was, we're going to get to zero carbon neutrality. We're going to get to carbon neutral. That's not what you want to be. We need to get to zero emissions. It was just a flim flam. Oh, we're going to get to, so we'll plant trees and we can still burn fossil fuels. But Jake, again,
you're talking about his record.
But I'm talking about both. What he ran on, and also, his record was not good either. I mean, we just talked about a terrible vote that Franchot made, but I don't have all this in the back of my head. You brought up King. I think what you said about King and his ties to developers is very relevant and very serious. And none of us can know everything. So we have to discuss with each other what we know and share it. And then we can also, just as we shouldn't trust anybody, including Jimmy, we shouldn't trust what the other one says. So we have to look into it. But when people build up a record of trust, then we believe them until they show that they're not believable. If John King, turned around and became a right winger in office, then it would be very, very upsetting and destabilizing.
He's been an establishment Democrat his whole career.
We got it. You don't like King. He is an establishment Democrat. So is Peter Franchot, if anything, moved from being a more progressive Democrat to a sort of a Republican. So I'd hardly
should have endorsed him.
I know, but I know, but to say, well, he's a legitimate choice over King, I'm not going to buy that. I'm not saying, but fine. Okay, fair enough. And my opinion with regard to Raskin is that he has demonstrated that he is not independent in any way of the Democratic Party. And in fact, to the extent he takes somewhat progressive positions on some issues, it doesn't move the needle. It's in cases where it doesn't matter to the Democratic establishment. He showed his fealty to them by the hyper-partisan impeachment hearings that actually led to Trump becoming more popular. I do accept, though, what you said. I think it may have had a short-term impact on the Republican Party's unpopularity as well. And you did see that maybe in the midterms, which weren't nearly as bad for the Democrats as many of us expected. I think that's a good analysis, Jake. I would just say this, in the end, it's not enough. If you want to stem fascism, if you want to bring power back to the people, then you have to fight for them. And the Democrat Party is not doing that. And Jamie Raskin isn't doing that.
Yeah, certainly not as much as I would like. But all I'm saying is if it's a progressive off between John King and Jamie Raskin, I think Jamie Raskin easily takes the cake, and John King hasn't been in the position to show. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's an alternate universe out there where John King's our governor right now, and we have like Medicare for all and a living wage and all of this stuff. But I'll
be fair. I think Wes Moore in some respects has surpassed my expectations, so I'm pleased about that.
Yeah,
Jake, final word from you, Jake. I'm going to let you go, but I hope you will come back and we can have a dedicated show to local or truly local organizing, because that's what we had agreed to talk about, and we never got there. And I'll plead guilty.
No worries. No, I think it was a good discussion nonetheless. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, we're going to call it a day. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you, Jake, or morning if you're in the left coast or somewhere like that. Really do appreciate Jake joining me. Good luck on your studies. Mr. Burdett, continue your great work as an organizer in Howard County. Don't forget, you can check Jake out at Jake_Burdett. As soon as he said that was his handle, you see I put it right up there for you. We'll be back tomorrow.